Even if you don't recognise the name Edward Hopper, you've almost certainly seen some of his work. His unsettling depictions of American life, where everything kind of seems okay, but somehow isn't, have come to epitomise the loneliness of urban living. None more so than his iconic Nighthawks, a haunting late-night diner scene in which disconnected customers sit silently under stark fluorescent lighting, lost in their own thoughts. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today we're exploring the disconcerting world of American artist Edward Hopper. To find out about the man behind the paintings and why he returned so often to themes of solitude and sorrowful contemplation. We'll focus on Hopper's personal story, how a shy boy from a small town became one of America's most celebrated artists. It's a tale of patience, perseverance, and a singular vision, unfolding slowly, rather like one of his paintings. Edward Hopper was born in 1882 in the village of Nyack, New York, 25 miles north of Manhattan. His father, Garrett, was a mild-mannered dry goods merchant. His mother, Elizabeth, came from a family with artistic leanings, and he grew up in a comfortable middle-class home. From an early age, it was clear that he had a talent for drawing. By 5, he was already sketching, and unlike so many parents of that era who wanted solid professions for their sons, his fully supported his interest. They provided him with pencils, paper, paints, and illustrated magazines, and he started signing and dating his drawings at the age of 10, as if aware even then that his art mattered. Many of his early sketches survive, simple things like a vase, a cup, or geometric shapes, but they reveal a fascination with light and shadow that will become a hallmark of his later style. The household was a quiet one, dominated by his strict Baptist mother, his older sister Marion, a doting grandmother, and a live-in maid. And Edward was a tall, gangly child, shooting up to 6 feet by the age of 12. But he was gentle, bookish, and introspective. He experimented with many different media: pen and ink, charcoal, watercolour, and oils. He drew from nature, and even dabbled in creating political cartoons and comical scenes, showing a wry sense of humour in his sketches. He loved ships and the sea, and carved model boats, and for a time he imagined a future for himself as a naval architect. But by the end of his school years, his passion for painting was all-consuming, and when he graduated in 1899, he announced he wanted to pursue art as a career. His parents agreed, on one condition. If he was going to be an artist, he should have a reliable way of making a living, which in their eyes meant commercial illustration, not fine art. At 18, Hopper began a correspondence course, but he soon moved to the big city and enrolled at the New York School of Art, now the Parsons School of Design, one of the best places for an aspiring artist at the turn of the century. It was an exciting time in the New York art world, a time of change when traditional academic styles were giving way to something a bit more gritty. Robert Henry was at the forefront of this change. He and a group of artists, later dubbed the Ash Can School, believed in painting everyday urban scenes and the working class, not romantic landscapes or aristocratic portraits. Henry told his students, "It isn't the subject that counts, but what you feel about it. Forget about art, paint what truly interests you in life." Henry's words made a deep impression on Hopper. Up to this point, he had admired the French Impressionists like Manet and Degas. and he modelled some of his early work after them. But Henry's philosophy, paint your world, paint your truth, began pushing Hopper towards the honest, unsentimental scenes that would define his lifetime's work. Coming from a conservative home, Hopper found the life drawing classes a bit shocking at first. He was shy and, by all accounts, rather prudish as a young man, and standing at an easel with a naked figure in front of him was very much outside his comfort zone. But he persevered, and in time grew more confident in sketching the human form. One of his earliest oil paintings from this time already hints at the themes of isolated figures in cropped interior spaces that would later make him famous. In these formative years, however, Hopper painted all sorts of subjects, from still lifes to landscapes and self-portraits, trying to find his own voice. By 1905, Hopper felt ready to start earning some money, and following his parents' advice, he sought work as a commercial illustrator, landing a job with an advertising agency, drawing illustrations and cover art for trade magazines. It was steady work, but far from glamorous. For a young man with dreams of becoming a serious painter, churning out magazine covers of well-heeled, smiling couples frolicking in the sun was tedious in the extreme. And he later made no secret of the fact that he loathed illustration, finding it creatively stifling. But it paid the bills, and he would continue to rely on illustration jobs on and off for the next 20 years. But he never stopped thinking of himself as a real artist, and at the time, Paris was the place for any real artist to be. So, at the age of 24, Edward Hopper sailed off to France, staying for 10 months in accommodation arranged by his mother at the Baptist Church of Paris. Fantastic location, right in the heart of the city, but very much under the watchful eye of ladies reporting back to his mama to make sure he behaved himself. He completed 42 paintings while he was in Paris and dozens of sketches, but almost all of the paintings are devoid of human life. Where people do appear, they seem very much secondary to the architectural structures. For me, the scenes of Paris Hopper chose to paint on this trip say a lot about his personality. He was in one of the most exciting, vibrant cities in the world, buzzing with life and new ideas. But he didn't attend any classes in Paris. He didn't try to exhibit any of his work. He quietly wandered the streets, sketchpad in hand, and studiously visited the museums. But Paris was famous for its nightlife and its relaxed morals. And although he was a frequent attender at the theatre and the opera, he didn't partake in any of the other entertainments on offer. And this sketch from his room may be as close as he got to enjoying the pleasures of the Belle Époque. One of the ladies at his accommodation wrote to his parents that he was being a good boy. But he did meet an English girl and followed her to London, perhaps intending to pop the question. But on hearing she was already engaged, he rapidly retreated. And although the iconoclastic waves of modern art were sweeping through Europe at the time, Cubism and Fauvism, Hopper wasn't that interested. He gravitated to the old masters. On a trip to Amsterdam, he was deeply impressed by Rembrandt, especially the Night Watch, which he called the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. He also admired the Impressionists, particularly Monet and Manet and their use of light, which would leave a lasting influence on how Hopper rendered sun and shadow. He made 2 further trips to Europe over the next 4 years, visiting London, Berlin and Madrid. But ultimately, New York City was his home and the place where he would have to make his stand as an artist. And by 1908, Hopper had moved permanently into the city, renting a small studio apartment in Greenwich, working as an illustrator to get by, but in his free time painting what he wanted to paint, determined to find success with his unique way of looking at the world. The next decade, the 1910s, were years of struggle for Hopper. Breaking into the art scene wasn't easy. He participated in some group exhibitions organised by his old teacher Robert Henry, and even won a small prize here and there. But by and large, the critics and the buying public showed little interest in Hopper's paintings. It was a time of immense frustration and soul-searching, and he later admitted that he often had difficulty deciding what to paint and would go for months without producing anything. His friend and fellow artist Walter Tittle described Hopper as suffering long periods of unconquerable inertia, sitting for days at a time before his easel in helpless unhappiness, unable to raise a hand to break the spell. These words paint a vivid picture of the depth of Hopper's despondency during the dark days when his career stubbornly refused to take off. He was a man who knew he had something to say through his art, but it seemed no one was interested. He was, in a sense, as lost and isolated as the lonely figures in his paintings. In 1912, seeking new ideas, Hopper travelled to Gloucester, a seaside holiday town and fishing port in Massachusetts, where he painted outdoors in the US for the first time. The harbour, the houses, and the first of many lighthouses. The following year he had a modest but important breakthrough. The Armory Show in New York, which aimed to introduce Americans to modern art, whether they wanted it or not, exhibited one of his paintings. And miraculously it sold for $250, around $8,000 today, his first sale. At last, at 31 years of age, this was it. He just needed a few more sales and he was made. Except there were no further sales, not immediately anyway, and this undoubtedly contributed to his periods of depression and inertia. In the same year his father died, and Hopper, now without parental support, moved into a cheap fourth-floor apartment in Greenwich Village, where he would live for the rest of his life. He continued to work away at the day job producing commercial art, which remained a source of frustration for him. It paid the rent, but brought no joy. Around this time, tiring of his stagnation in oil painting, Hopper turned his attention to the printmaking technique of etching. To his surprise, he proved quite adept at it, and over the next few years he produced around 70 etchings. Finely worked black and white images, many depicting the same kind of urban scenes and quiet moments that he tried to capture on canvas. These prints, multiple copies of which could be made to sell more cheaply, slowly led to Hopper getting some recognition. He won some awards and started being bought by museums. It was a slow burn rather than an explosion, but people were finally beginning to notice him and his vision of the world, tinged, as it is for so many, with sadness and solitude. In 1919, he had his first solo exhibition at the Whitney Studio Club in New York, which displayed 16 of his oil paintings, many of them the scenes of Paris he had completed a decade before. Surely this meant his years of struggle were over. But no. Sadly, the exhibition generated little interest, he didn't sell a single painting, and reviews were sparse. It seemed that his quiet, realist style was out of step with the Roaring Twenties art scene, which was buzzing with modernism. The real turning point in Edward Hopper's career came in 1923, when, on one of his painting expeditions to Gloucester, he met, purely by chance, Josephine Jo Nivison. They knew each other vaguely from art school days, but hadn't kept in touch. Jo was in many ways the polar opposite of Hopper, self-confident, vivacious, outgoing, and by this stage she had developed a moderately successful career for herself as an artist. Despite their contrasting personalities, they reconnected over the summer, and Jo encouraged him to try a new medium, watercolour, her own specialty. The results were magical. Hopper's watercolour paintings of Gloucester, Victorian houses, sunlit walls, fishing shacks and boats captured light and form in a brilliant new way. There was a vitality and spontaneity to them. And thanks to Joe's connections and enthusiastic promotion of his work, the Brooklyn Museum bought one for its permanent collection. Critics took note as well, praising the bold simplicity and honesty of his scenes. All of a sudden, Edward Hopper went from invisible anonymity to someone on the radar of major museums. Buoyed by this success, and by his now blossoming relationship with Joe, Hopper's fortunes rapidly improved. And just a year after their fateful meeting in Gloucester, Edward and Joe married. He was 41, she 40, and it was the first and only marriage for them both. They made an unconventional pair. The tall, painfully shy, quiet and somewhat reclusive Hopper, and the petite, sociable and extroverted Joe, who later described their difference by joking, "Talking to Eddie is like dropping a stone in a well, except that it doesn't thump when it hits bottom." Different they may have been, but they were devoted to each other, and Joe more or less gave up her own career to support her husband. She became his muse, manager, and closest companion for the rest of his life, as well as the model for almost every female figure he painted from then on. A glamorous woman in a cafe, or lonely girl by a window. Joe's features are in all of them. She also took on the unglamorous tasks behind the scenes, keeping records of his artworks, handling sales and correspondence, and often acting as intermediary between the shy artist and the outside world. Their marriage was far from blissful, however. They had fierce arguments, which sometimes became physical. Joe scratched and bit him to the bone, and he slapped her back, enough to colour her with bruises at times. But there was an underlying bond of love and interdependence that kept them together. And on their 25th wedding anniversary, she told him they deserved a medal for distinguished combat. And he complied by creating a coat of arms made from a rolling pin and ladle. Both were strong-willed, and living and working so closely together sometimes caused sparks to fly. But neither ever considered life without the other, and between fights they wrote each other romantic notes in French. They settled into a rather Spartan lifestyle, living in the small studio apartment on Washington Square North, where Hopper had been since 1913. And they had no children. Their world revolved around art and each other. Hopper had been waiting a long time, but success finally came in October 1924, when he had a solo exhibition at the Rain Gallery in New York, this time showcasing his watercolours. The show was a hit and almost all the paintings sold. At the age of 42, Edward Hopper was finally financially secure enough and artistically validated enough to do what he had dreamt of for years, quitting commercial illustration for good. He continued painting in oil as well as watercolour, and was now able to focus on the subjects that truly interested him. He had always been drawn to everyday American scenes, the street corner, the storefront, the sunlit side of a White House, the inside of a movie theatre. With Joe by his side, he travelled to find fresh material, taking road trips around New England every summer, especially Massachusetts and Maine. In 1930 they discovered Cape Cod. The light and the buildings captivated them so much that they had a summer house built in South Truro, to which they would return every year to take in the sea and paint the houses, lighthouses and beaches, often devoid of people, yet somehow imbued with human presence. Back in New York the rest of the year, Hopper continued to depict the metropolis in all its lonely glory, its diners, apartment buildings, theatres and offices. In paintings like Automat, first shown on St. Valentine's Day, a woman stares into her coffee cup, sitting alone in a brightly lit cafe at night. Or Chop Suey, with two women talking under the glow of a Chinese restaurant sign. Hopper began to define an era of American life on canvas. critics began to recognise something special in his work, a kind of uneasy mood that no one else was seeking to convey at the time. The term Hopperesque even entered the vocabulary to describe the unique atmosphere of understated drama and solitude that his pictures evoked. By the end of the 1920s, collectors and museums were vying with each other to snap up his paintings. The wealthy art patron Stephen Clark purchased his house by the railroad and donated it to the newly founded Museum of Modern Art in New York, the first oil painting by any artist to enter MoMA's permanent collection. Quite an honour. The early 1930s solidified Edward Hopper's standing as one of the leading American artists. While the Great Depression devastated the economy and many artists struggled to survive, Hopper's works continued to sell well. In 1933 came the ultimate validation as an artist. The Museum of Modern Art gave him a large-scale retrospective, the kind of career triumph most artists can only dream of. But despite the success, the acclaim and the financial rewards, Hopper never changed his lifestyle. He and Joe remained in the same old apartment in the village. They summered in their Cape Cod house and lived simply and frugally. Hopper was not one for the social whirl of the art world. If anything, he avoided public appearances and turned down some awards, preferring his privacy. He was described by his friends as a quiet, gentle man with a dry sense of humour. Someone who could be good company in small circles, but who was also perfectly content with silence.
I'm a painter of rather wide range of subject, really, if you know my work. Perhaps more than any painter I know. I've done an awful lot of different kind of things.
He was often taciturn, sometimes grumpy, and very set in his ways. He loved to read and go to the theatre and listen to classical music, and his daily routine and personal habits barely changed over decades. And he continued to paint what interested him and let the rest of the world fuss over the latest trends and fashions. In the late 30s and early 1940s, Hopper produced some of his greatest works. New York Movie, a poignant scene of a lone movie usher lost in thought by the theatre stairs. As always, he prepared meticulously for his paintings. There are at least 53 sketches of the theatre interior and the figure of the pensive usherette in this work. Office at Night, which hints at untold stories in a sparsely furnished office after hours. Then came Nighthawks in 1942, the painting that would become his most famous work. It was painted just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when America was drawn into the conflict that had been raging in the rest of the world for 2 years. The painting shows an all-night diner on a city corner. 3 customers and a counterman exist together, but apart, each seemingly absorbed in their own thoughts as the empty street wraps around them. Nighthawks is often interpreted as a depiction of wartime anxiety or urban alienation, but Hopper himself denied any specific narrative, saying it was just a restaurant in Greenwich Village. It sold almost immediately for $3,000, a significant sum at the time, to the Art Institute of Chicago, where it remains on display to this day. Hopper, now 60 years old, had created the defining image of his career. It encapsulates so much of what he'd been trying to say, a feeling of solitude, even when surrounded by people. The 1940s were a bittersweet time for Hopper. He was at the height of his powers artistically, and his work was in demand, but the world of art was shifting around him. Abstract expressionism and artists like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning were breaking away completely from the idea of art as representational. Hopper had little interest in these new fads and continued to paint in his straightforward realist style, ignoring the hype, which meant that by the 1950s he was regarded as rather old-fashioned and out of step. This didn't seem to bother Hopper in the slightest. He believed that art should spring from an artist's inner life and personal vision, not from fashionable theories. Great art is the outward expression of an inner life of the artist, he wrote, and this inner life will result in his personal vision of the world. His productivity did slow somewhat as he got older, and in the late 1940s he went through a fallow period and found himself unable to summon his creative energy. He confessed, "I wish I could paint more. I get sick of reading and going to the movies." He had always enjoyed good health, but he needed surgery on his prostate and had thyroid problems. Joe, always by his side, took care of him during his bouts of illness and kept their household running. And he continued to create noteworthy paintings into his 70s. Morning Sun, depicting a woman, Joe naturally, sitting on a bed bathed in the morning sunlight, and Hotel by a Railroad are examples of his later works that have the same Hopper magic. And in his later years, accolades continued to come. In 1950, the Whitney Museum of American Art organised a full retrospective of his work. 2 years later, he was selected to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale, one of the biggest art exhibitions in the world, suggesting the lonely outsider was now regarded as a national treasure of American art. In 1956, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 1961, Jacqueline Kennedy chose one of Hopper's paintings to decorate the White House. He even appeared on the cover of Time magazine, celebrated as a quintessential American realist. Through all of this, Hopper remained unaffected and somewhat reclusive. He preferred the company of a few close artist friends and his wife, and he generally avoided interviews, letting Joe handle these whenever possible. If reporters asked him about the meaning behind his paintings, he would often deflect, insisting that the truth was on the canvas and that he himself didn't always know the deeper meanings in his work. In 1959, his canvas, Excursion into Philosophy, shows a man sitting on a bed with an open book beside a half-dressed woman, turned away. The book, later identified by Joe as Plato, suggests that even as an old man, Hopper was still contemplating the themes of longing and existential solitude that had always intrigued him. By the mid-1960s, Hopper's health was failing more seriously. He and Joe were both in their 80s and still living in their beloved, but by now very old-fashioned Washington Square apartment. He painted his last work in 1965, Two Comedians, himself and Joe, movingly taking a final bow on a stage. 2 years later, he quietly passed away in his studio, old age having finally caught up with him. He was laid to rest back in Nyack, in the family plot, returning to the soil of his hometown where his journey began. Joe, who had been his steadfast partner through more than 40 years of marriage, was in poor health herself, and she died just 10 months later and was buried by his side. Before she died, however, Joe performed one last act of devotion to secure her husband's legacy, bequeathing their entire collection of art, all of his unsold paintings, drawings, etchings and documents, as well as her own artwork, to the Whitney Museum, the institution that had been so instrumental in establishing his name in the early days. And today, thanks to her gift, the Whitney holds the largest collection of Hopper's work. Joe's own paintings didn't fare quite so well, however, with many being controversially let go by the museum. Standing back and looking at Edward Hopper's life, one can't help but notice how closely his art and personal journey intertwined. He lived, much as the figures in his paintings, quietly, introspectively, immersing himself in routine. He was not a flamboyant or gregarious man. He didn't cultivate publicity or raise any eyebrows with outrageous behaviour. His life was on the surface rather uneventful, the drama all happening on the canvas, or rather hinted at on the canvas, implied, suggested, but rarely shown. In the words of one commentator, even his sunniest pictures touch us where we are most vulnerable, and have a suggestion of melancholy being enacted. Though it seems clear that he went through periods of depression and inactivity in the 1910s and late 1940s, we don't know if he ever had any treatment or therapy. He was certainly interested in Freud and the power of the subconscious, and wrote, "So much of every art is an expression of the subconscious that it seems to me most of all the important qualities are put there unconsciously, and little of importance by the conscious intellect." One of his caricatures also hints that he thought that he and Jo might benefit from a little couples therapy for their squabbling. But he was a private man who avoided talking about himself and the psychological meaning of his work, so it's hard to know what really went on in his mind in his long life. In trying to understand him as a man, I think his personality was summed up well in the Whitney retrospective catalogue from 1950. The pervading sense of loneliness in Hopper's art is linked to his reserved emotional attitude towards human beings, and to the strong emotion he concentrates on the non-human elements. As a psychiatrist, I was struck that many of his personality traits and his very fixed lifestyle could be features of what would nowadays be called an autistic spectrum disorder. But the most authoritative biography of him relies heavily on Jo's diary entries, which may give a one-sided view of him by someone who was a feisty character herself. And we are still discovering new things about him. A cache of letters that has only recently come to light has revealed that when he was in Paris, he was friendly with Alta Hillsdale, an American woman who wrote at times flirty letters, but more often apologetic letters for standing him up. They corresponded for several years, but when she finally announced she was marrying someone else, Hopper was devastated, and it has been suggested that this powerful painting is a response to this news, with the tragic central figure representing not Alta, but Hopper himself, sad, abandoned, and ashamed. So I don't think we can speculate too much about diagnoses, and it is better to reflect on his life as someone who persevered through long years of obscurity and self-doubt, who stayed true to his vision when it wasn't fashionable, and who finally found an audience that understood and appreciated his unique vision of the world. His journey reminds us that sometimes a life pursued with sincerity and focus, even a seemingly ordinary, almost boring life, can yield extraordinary creations. Edward Hopper captured the American soul on canvas, and his legacy, much like the light in his paintings, endures, quietly illuminating the human experience for all of us who pause and take notice. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please give me a thumbs up and leave a comment. I do enjoy reading them and I respond to as many as I can. If art is your thing, please check out my videos on some very different artists. Francisco Goya, whose work I enjoyed on my recent trip to Madrid. Hieronymus Bosch, who has a whole room devoted to him in the Prado. Van Gogh, Egon Schiele, Frida Kahlo, Henry Fuseli. Richard Dadd, who murdered his father. Andy Warhol, who also began his career as a commercial artist, of course. Louis Wain, the painter of cats. The nightmarish Polish painter Beksinski. Suzanne Valadon, who began as a model but later earned the respect of those who painted her. And Zelda Fitzgerald, who was far more than just F. Scott's wife. And if you have any ideas on who I should tackle next, please let me know. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.